Hi everyone. In today's video, I just wanted to go through the hormones of the anterior pituitary gland. If you haven't already, make sure you watch my video on the posterior pituitary gland and the hormones that it releases, as I believe that its mechanisms are actually more simple than the anterior pituitary gland. Anyway, let's get into this video. So the anterior pituitary gland is actually the only true endocrine gland in the pituitary gland complex. As we mentioned in the previous video, if I just quickly draw a rough schematic of the pituitary gland, the anterior pituitary gland will jut out something like this, and the posterior pituitary gland will be just present behind it, like so. So the anterior pituitary gland is made up of epithelial tissue, and this means that it essentially is able to synthesize and secrete its own hormones, whilst on the other hand, as the posterior pituitary gland is made up of nervous tissue, in its case it's only able to store the appropriate hormones that it will eventually secrete. The synthesis of the hormones actually occurs in the hypothalamus. Even though the anterior pituitary gland is able to synthesize and therefore secrete its own hormones, the synthesis and to some extent the secretion of these hormones is still controlled by the hypothalamus. So if we redraw the pituitary gland here, with this structure being the hypothalamus, there is a special part of the hypothalamus that's called the ventral hypothalamus. And this is a collection of nerve cell bodies, so soma, that are responsible for the synthesis of the regulating hormones of the anterior pituitary gland. So let's go through that more slowly. So we have nerve cell bodies which contain the nuclei of the particular neuron, and these neurons are responsible for synthesizing many hormones. These include growth hormone, inhibiting hormone, growth hormone releasing hormone, corticotropin releasing hormone, thyrotropin releasing hormone, and lastly, although it is not directly involved with the ventral hypothalamus, one of the hormones that actually controls the processes of the anterior pituitary gland is dopamine. So let me just first simplify all these names so they become easier to write. Now, all of these first four hormones, are all synthesized by the ventral hypothalamus. This means that the neuronal cell bodies make these hormones in order to control the hormones that are released by the anterior pituitary gland. But you may be wondering, how did these hormones here get to the anterior pituitary gland? Well, unlike the posterior pituitary gland, the process is a little bit more complicated. So let me first redraw this diagram with a better indication of what we call the infundibulum. So if we have the hypothalamus here, there will actually be a stalk-like projection with the anterior pituitary gland present and the posterior pituitary gland present. Now, if the ventral hypothalamus is present here, ventral in this case meaning on the underside rather than at the front, this stalk here, or the connecting stalk, is called the infundibulum. Now, in order for a hormone to be transferred from the ventral hypothalamus to the anterior pituitary gland, it must first pass through the infundibulum. So the manner in which this occurs is that axonal bodies extend from the soma, from the ventral hypothalamus, into the infundibulum, and in the hormones, or in these four hormones journey from the ventral hypothalamus to the anterior pituitary gland, they come in contact with what we call the primary capillary plexus. Now, a capillary plexus is simply just a combination of many capillaries arranged in a capillary bed type structure. And here is what we call neurocrine signaling. So if I were to zoom in on this particular part of the diagram, what this will look like is the neuronal axon extending off, with the enlarged part being the terminal bouton, and a capillary also present here. And the neuron will in fact release its neurotransmitters from its synapse, or from the synaptic cleft, into the capillary. And this is an important feature of the signaling technique here, as actually the transfer of the hormones is through the blood vessels. So we need to convert this neuronal or electrical message into a chemical message that can be transferred through the blood vessel. And the only way to do this is to convert it through neurocrine signaling. Now, from the primary capillary plexus, the chemical messenger, which is a hormone, is now able to travel through blood vessels that will eventually lead through to the anterior pituitary gland. However, even though there is epithelial tissue present here, there is another capillary plexus that essentially allows for the exchange of the hormone with the actual epithelial cells through diffusion on the anterior pituitary gland. And as this is called the primary capillary plexus, which I'll just write as primary PC, this is called the secondary capillary plexus. Oops, sorry, not PC, CP. And this is called the secondary capillary plexus. So this is basically the journey that a hormone takes when it moves from the ventral hypothalamus to the anterior pituitary gland. And as I mentioned earlier, only these four hormones, which are the regulatory hormones, are the ones that actually take this journey. So you may be wondering, what happens after these? Sorry, I just realized that I've missed out on a hormone here. There has actually had to be gonadotropin releasing hormone present here as well. Sorry about that. So this is GnRH. Alright, we're back on track. So after all of these hormones have been released, or one by one they have been released in order to allow for the regulation of the hormones of the anterior pituitary gland, they can allow for the regulation of the actual hormones that the anterior pituitary gland synthesizes can now be released. So what are the hormones that the anterior pituitary gland releases? Well, they all relate to these 5 hormones that I outlined before. So let's go through them serially. First, we have growth hormone inhibiting hormone and growth hormone releasing hormone. So that should give us an indication that both GHIH and GHRH should control one hormone. And if you guessed it, that hormone is growth hormone. Now, growth hormone is actually quite a unique hormone in that it has 2 separate hormones that are actually controlling it. So growth hormone inhibiting hormone is released when levels of growth hormone in the blood are quite high, and therefore they have to be lowered, and therefore it inhibits the release of growth hormone from the anterior pituitary gland. Whilst on the other hand, growth hormone releasing hormone is able to stimulate the synthesis and release of growth hormone from the anterior pituitary gland in order to allow for blood levels to rise. The next hormone comes under the control of corticotropin releasing hormone. Now this hormone is actually quite important because CRH allows for many processes in the body to occur. In terms of the anterior pituitary gland, it allows for the release of adrenocorticotropic hormone. And I will just rewrite this as ACTH. Now, adrenocorticotropic hormone is actually quite important, as I mentioned earlier, as it is able to then travel to the adrenal glands and allow for the release of adrenaline and cortisol. And as you may all know, adrenaline and cortisol are both involved in the fight or flight response. Cortisol can be also involved in stress responses whilst also being involved in the fasted state. And adrenaline can also be involved in the fasted state, and also when, for example, if you're suddenly woken up in the middle of the night and you have to run somewhere because there's a fire, then adrenaline is quickly released because it allows for a quick response from the body. Also, growth hormone, which I forgot to mention, is, as its name suggests, allow for growth within the body. So in general, it allows for tissue repair and growth. And also, in terms of the fasted state, it allows for many processes that allow for the increase of blood sugar levels. Now, we also have thyrotropin-releasing hormone. Now, similar to adrenocorticotropic hormone, this hormone is actually first in a line of many different hormones that are released in the body. So, thyrotropin-releasing hormone allows for the stimulation of the release of thyroid-stimulating hormone from the anterior pituitary gland. And thyroid-stimulating hormone can then activate, similar to the adrenal glands by CRH, so adrenal glands are here. Thyroid-stimulating hormone, as the name suggests, has an effect on the thyroid gland and is actually able to have a twofold effect. This is because it allows for the release of the 2 thyroid hormones, which are T3 and T4. T3 stands for triiodothyronine, and T4 stands for thyroxine. So the release of these 2 hormones is able to allow for a particular effect to happen. The final hormone, which I forgot actually beforehand, is gonadotropin-releasing hormone, which is condensed to GnRH. Now, gonadotropin-releasing hormone is actually involved in the release of 2 hormones from the anterior pituitary gland. These are follicle-stimulating hormone which I'll abbreviate to FSH, And there's also luteinizing hormone, which I'll write as LH. Now, follicle-stimulating hormone is a hormone that is able to allow for many processes involved with sexual organs and sexual development, so it's able to allow for the development of secondary sexual characteristics. And in terms of females, it's also able to allow for the development of an ovarian follicle. Luteinizing hormone also has a role in developing secondary sexual characteristics. And in males, for example, it is able to allow for the stimulation of spermatogenesis. So, in review, if we head back to the top, the anterior pituitary gland is a true endocrine gland that contains epithelial tissue and is able to allow for the release and synthesis of various hormones. It is controlled by the ventral hypothalamus, and through the infundibulum, the various hormones that are synthesized by the ventral hypothalamus, which are growth hormone inhibiting hormone, growth hormone releasing hormone, corticotropin releasing hormone, thyrotropin releasing hormone, and gonadotropin releasing hormone, are able to allow for the release of various hormones that are synthesized in the anterior pituitary gland by first passing through the axonal bodies of the neurons that synthesize these hormones into the primary capillary plexus, which converts a neural signal into an endocrine signal, thus getting the name neurocrine, passing through the primary capillary plexus through blood vessels into the secondary capillary plexus, which totally envelops the anterior pituitary gland and therefore allows for the transfer of these hormones into the gland itself. And finally, these regulating hormones allow for the release of various hormones of the anterior pituitary gland itself. So GHIH and GHRH in tandem allow for the release of growth hormone. CRH allows for the release of adrenocorticotropic hormone, which eventually allows for the release of adrenaline and cortisol. TRH allows for the release of thyroid-stimulating hormone, which in turn allows for the release of T3 and T4. And gonadotropin-releasing hormone allows for the release of follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone, which are involved in various sexual characteristics. Now, as you may have noticed, I have actually left out one hormone, and that, as I mentioned earlier, was dopamine. So dopamine is actually a hormone that is not released by the ventral hypothalamus. However, as a neurotransmitter, it actually has an effect on a particular hormone in the anterior pituitary gland. So if we sort of take dopamine as a separate case here, dopamine allows for the release of a hormone called prolactin. Now, prolactin is synthesized by the anterior pituitary gland and therefore is released. However, it is done by dopamine. Some roles of prolactin include the synthesis of milk from mammary glands, and it works actually together with oxytocin to do this. And as the name suggests, prolactin, it also allows for the lactation, or the process of lactation from mammary glands. So, these are all of the hormones of the anterior pituitary gland. Just lastly, dopamine, once again, just to stress, not synthesized by the ventral hypothalamus, but allows for the release of a hormone in the anterior pituitary gland, which is prolactin. I hope you've enjoyed this video. Thank you very much for watching.